It is my pleasure to introduce our panel. Randy and Bill and Kimro, can you please become visible? Hi. Bill's there. Okay. So we have three members of our board who are going to speak to us about street trees and particularly about street tree ordinances. I want to introduce them very briefly. Hi, Bill. Introduce them very briefly. Then what we're going to do is that Randy is going to make a short presentation about street tree ordinances. We're going to have each of them talk about how this played out, the creation of an ordinance, passing of an ordinance played out in their own municipality. And then we're going to have a little discussion and then some time for questions. We have this blocked out and I'm going to try to keep things going so we can get in as much information as possible. But just to start, Dr. Randy Eckel is Vice President for Membership of the Native Plant Society. She has been a member of the Frenchtown Planning Board and Board of Adjustment for 20 years and chair of that board for 17 years and has been on the board of directors of the New Jersey Planning Officials since 2018. Kim Rowe is co-leader of the Monmouth chapter of NPSNJ and co-chair of the Independent Garden Center Committee. And the goal of that committee is to help the retail garden center industry increase local access to native plants. She is a member of the Environmental Commission in Brielle. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Brielle? Brielle, sorry about that, which is located in Monmouth County. That's right? Okay. Bill Young is ecology representative on the NPSNJ board, and he is a member of the Point Pleasant Environmental Commission. He is a wetland scientist with Reforestation Solutions, Inc., and an adjunct professor of ecology at the University of Pennsylvania. So we're going to turn this over to Randy, who's going to share her screen and present a slide presentation that was done by Russell Ferneri, who is another member of our board and was recently presented at the ANJAC conference, but he has kindly given us permission to use this. Randy, you're muted. You're still muted. Randy?
Now I assume everyone can see that, now that I'm unmuted. Yes, I did want to thank Russ for letting us use these slides. He put these together on behalf of the NPSNJ for a presentation this fall to the ANJAC Fall Congress on the subject of the tree removal and replacement ordinance. So I'm going to give a little history of what that's all about. This is a issue really that's not limited to New Jersey, but in New Jersey, particularly, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection required municipalities to adopt a tree removal and replacement ordinance by May of 2024. This was part of their stormwater protection, and they created a draft ordinance for municipalities to try to work with to adopt that. The rationale behind this was because trees are so critical to the water cycle and to mitigating stormwater runoff. And anyone in the Northeast, and certainly anyone in New Jersey, knows that we've had terrible problems in the last 5-10 years with flooding in New Jersey and terrible runoff problems, which have led to erosion, pollution, loss of life, loss of buildings. And New Jersey is a very developed state. There certainly are some very rural parts of the state. But as we heard earlier, a lot of people get very nervous about big trees. I don't know why. I love big trees, but they get nervous about big trees. So the state is trying to reduce the number of trees that we are losing in the state, because the ordinance that need to be adopted by municipalities had to address both the removal of trees and the replacement of those trees that are reduced. That are removed. And that's really the critical part one of the critical parts of the ordinance. So MPSNJ became aware of some of the problems with the draft ordinance that was out there, and a lot of municipalities were looking at adopting ordinances that, for example, listed acceptable replacement trees. The list of acceptable replacement trees was incredibly short, and in some cases included both invasive species and left out hundreds of native trees. One of the reasons that a lot of the tree commissions across the state, one of the reasons they've looked at non-native trees in some cases in the past has been they've been very concerned about the survival of trees in urban and roadway environments. But one of the things that was very important to understand about the tree removal and replacement ordinance that was being recommended was that it didn't simply address yard trees and street trees. This, in municipalities, it addressed any and all trees except for on farmland. So we were looking at trees in swampland and on dunes and woodlots and steep slopes and ridges. And the list of trees was extremely short that was being suggested for a lot of these ordinances. So one of the NPSNJ has an advocacy group, and one of the things that the advocacy committee recommended was for everyone to check your municipality's tree removal and replacement ordinances. These ordinances were supposed to be adopted by May of 2024. I have tried to track this down myself, and I've actually talked to Russ about this. And one of the things that's very interesting is there doesn't seem to be any way to know what municipalities in New Jersey have even adopted these ordinances yet, even though there was a deadline of May to keep municipalities in line with their stormwater protection. So check to see if you have an ordinance in place, and when you see what is being worked on or what is already in place, see if there's a very narrow list of replacement trees. See if it excludes invasive species. See if your ordinance allows for the removal of invasive species without penalty. And another thing that the draft ordinance did, and I'll go into this a little bit more in just a moment when I start talking about the experience in Frenchtown, New Jersey, was allowing for replacement of smaller trees when you're talking about taprooted species. The draft ordinance talks about replacing a tree of like size. So if you took down a tree with a 6-inch caliper, six inches around, or 12 inches around or larger, that you had to replace it with a good sized tree. You had to replace it with a large, 3, 4, 6-inch caliper tree, which isn't going to work very well for taprooted specimens, taprooted species that we discussed just a few moments ago in one of the previous talks today that do much better if you plant them small. So these are 3 things that the Advocacy Committee of MPSNJ flagged for special consideration, that everyone should be looking to their municipalities' ordinances to see if they address these things. One of the things that is important to note when you are looking to see what the ordinances in your municipality say, all ordinances can be amended. If an ordinance has already been put in place in your municipality, and I think most of them by now have been, but I really don't know because, again, the list of which municipalities have adopted the ordinances is not available. Ordinances can be adopted. So if you look at your municipality's tree removal and replacement ordinance, you can recommend amendments to that ordinance. And those amendments can be, it is a process, it will take several months, but that is a process that can be done. Once an ordinance is adopted by a municipality, it is not a done deal. That is not now set in stone and unchangeable. You can get those ordinances changed. And just a little information about the advocacy group of NPSNJ. You can get a hold of them through npsnj.org. There's a tab there. And any concerns or questions that you have, you can contact them through that. I'm not actually on the advocacy committee, although I did work very closely with Russ Fernari when he was putting together these slides for the NJAC conference.
Thank you, Randy. And I think we're going to leave the previous slide up, I think, if you don't mind, because we can, we're going to refer back to it, I think, during the discussion.
Well, Elaine, I was going to go on to the slides for my presentation, but then
I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
I can bring that one.
Please,
I can bring that one back up when we get to that.
Actually, you're next because I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So
right.
Yes, please do. I'm sorry about that. Yes, just go right on, Randy. Thank you.
I was being sneaky. I just sort of backed them up to each other.
Very sneaky. Okay.
All right. So now, as Elaine was saying, I and Kim and Bill, we're going to sort of walk through the process that our municipalities went through to adopt an ordinance. I'm trying very hard to stay on time, Elaine. So it's a story of one municipality, Frenchtown, New Jersey. It's a Delaware River community in Hunterdon County. Part at the top of the screen you're seeing there is actually Pennsylvania. The houses and whatnot in the foreground there, that is Frenchtown, New Jersey. We've got 1,640 people, 1.1 square miles, 637 households. Portions of the borough are either too steep for development or at high risk of flooding due to the proximity of the Delaware River, and we have two C1 streams that run through. So if you look at this image, which only shows part of the municipality, this is the Delaware River's over here. Let's see if I can point. This is the Delaware River here, but all this blue dotted area, the green area, this is all encumbered due to flood issues, and the red is encumbered due to steep slope issues. Obviously, Frenchtown, when we have a flooding situation that comes through, when we have severe storms that come through, there's a lot of Frenchtown, which is at risk. You know, we did not fear as badly as Lambertville, New Jersey during Hurricane Ian when it came through, but we had major flooding in our municipality. We had cars that were washing through the streets. We didn't have any houses that went down, but we did have roads that washed out during Hurricane Ian when it came through. So this is flood issues and the importance of trees, quite frankly, to help to hold soil and water and slow down the flow of water is very important to communities like Frenchtown. So just a little back history, right about 2004, which is about the time I joined the Frenchtown Planning Board, there was an attempt by Borough Council to introduce an ordinance that would have required permits to remove trees. That is the earliest that I know that Frenchtown tried to do it. I'm not sure it is the first time that they tried to do it, but they tried to do that in 2004. And it did not work at all. The residents objected loudly. The ordinance was not adopted. And one of the things that Elaine did not mention in my introduction, I actually also own Toadshade Wildflower Farm, which is in the borough of Frenchtown. We're a mail order nursery. I spent a lot of my time outdoors. And when word got around in the borough that this ordinance was being considered way back in 2004 that would have required a permit to remove trees, it sounded like there was a chainsaw convention in the borough. There were so many chainsaws running because people were like, no, I'm not going to have to apply for a permit to take down my tree. It did not work. And I don't know all the ins and outs of it back then, but I think part of it was they did not have community engagement. They did not work with the community to do this. I know there are a lot of different municipalities throughout the state of New Jersey that have tried for years and years and years to create a tree removal ordinance of some sort. And they were stymied by folks in the community that really did not want one. So really, the requirement by the state to have a tree removal ordinance really pushed all the municipalities in the state of New Jersey forward to actually have to put in a tree removal ordinance. So this time around in New Jersey, I'm going to go through very briefly the process that we went through. Even though the original requirement was announced in 2022, that these ordinances were going to have to be adopted by municipalities by May of 2024, this was flying very far under the radar. A lot of this was actually coming through the engineering departments, through the municipalities, so it was actually excluding the planning departments and the environmental commissions. In our municipality, we became alerted to the fact, or reminded really, that this deadline was coming up in the New Jersey Planner, which is a publication of the New Jersey planning officials. This was one of their fall issues. Chairman of the planning board, I contacted the borough planner. I was like, we need to be on top of this. We need to do something about this. So in January, February 2024, our planner came up with a draft ordinance, which was based on the state draft ordinance, as well as parts from other municipalities. And immediately we noticed there were some really major red flags. The list of trees that were on that particular ordinance included, it only had about a dozen trees. And that would have been the only trees that you could use to replace any tree that was removed anywhere in the borough of Frenchtown. All the replacement trees had to be fairly large, so there was no exception for taprooted species. There was no exclusion for invasive species. And there was a big concern actually in the municipality from feedback that we had from folks in the borough, that to have a hazardous tree removed, you had to have it certified by an arborist. And people were very upset by the idea that they had trees dying on their property. They had hurricanes coming through and trees falling down, and it's already expensive, and now you're going to make them have to pay for an arborist to say, oh yeah, it's a dead tree, or oh yeah, it's falling on your house. So those were some major red flags that we spotted. In February 2024, we created a committee, which included the Borough Council President, a member of the Environmental Commission, a member of the Shade Tree Commission, and myself, the chair of the Planning Board. And we worked together to make fixes to that ordinance to try to make it acceptable, both to the spirit of what the ordinance was supposed to do, as well as to the community. By March 2024, we defined the list of acceptable trees as to any trees native to Hunterdon County or any neighboring county. So in doing so, we excluded all non-native trees as acceptable replacement trees and listed not simply the trees that are native just to Frenchtown. We can literally see Pennsylvania, from our house, but also surrounding counties. We recognize that taprooted species such as native oaks should be planted smaller for the long-term health of the tree. We created an exception for the removal of invasive species using the information center at the Invasive Species Strike Team website. And we created a process whereby hazardous and dying trees can be removed without incurring the cost of an arborist certification. In April 2024, the ordinance was recommended to council by the planning board and introduced by council. When we discussed it at our planning board meeting, we only had compliments from the community. We had no one from the community that was upset about that. When they introduced it to council, again, there was no one from the municipality that objected to the ordinance. And in May 2024, the ordinance was astonishingly adopted just in time to meet the deadline, despite the fact that it was a very frantic several months to get us to that point. The key points I think that we had there was we involved the Environmental Commission, we involved the Shade Tree Commission, we involved council and the planning board, all of which were opportunities to get feedback from the community on this ordinance. And I think I managed to keep it within time, didn't I?
You did it. Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you, Randy.
I can talk fast. All right.
Thank you. We're not gonna stop for questions after each presentation, but we'll keep a list of questions for the end. Kim, please.
Let me stop sharing so that Kim
I think
Kim's slides can come up. I think Mike has those.
Mm-hmm.
I have them.
Good.
Can we see this? But I need to get this into a slideshow mode. Okay, so I'm from Brielle, New Jersey. We're a small town on the Jersey Shore, right behind Manasquan. We're a river town. We have about 5,000 people. And because we're so close to the beach, we are basically completely built out. So there is no wild space in our town. There's really only one small park, and it's very much a recreational park. So tree protection ordinance in our town was very important because it would apply mostly to any new development, which usually involves removing something and building something new in its place. And a lot of times removing something includes removing trees. So how it started, I want to say that I'm a real novice in working with towns and government, town government. So this was very much a learning situation for me. But when we were alerted by the Advocacy Committee back in March, I thought this was an important thing. And I had recently been appointed as an alternate to the Environmental Commission. So I asked, do we have such an ordinance? And I have to tell you, I got some very big and angry pushback from members of the Environmental Commission itself, as well, which surprised the heck out of me, as well as the Shade Tree Commission, to even the idea of having a tree replacement ordinance. So that was my first surprise. But when we did get a chance to review the ordinance, we discovered there were a number of things that were problematic. The number one for me was that there was a $250 application fee to just apply for a permit. They were going to charge $250. And I thought, well, that's a perfect encouragement for everyone to avoid filing the permit at all. So that was something we wanted to address. They had also used, the Shade Tree Commission had been involved in developing the ordinance that was about to be adopted. And they basically just took the entire list from the Native Plant Society, Monmouth County list, and then they added what they liked. So that included some invasive trees and many ornamentals. And there was no penalty included for a tree removal without permit. So there was really no reason why anybody needed to follow this ordinance. And in fact, when we asked about it, I was definitely under the impression that folks were not, the idea was they were going to finish this ordinance and sign it into law and put it in the bottom drawer and not think too much more about it if they could. So, oh, by the way, this is a photo of my husband on the stump of a casualty in Manasquan, which was sad to lose. I think it was on a big oak tree, probably over 100 years old. So even though we recommended changes to the language that was in the ordinance, the council went ahead and they adopted the boilerplate. So this was, when I say boilerplate, I mean the language that was given by the state as sort of a starting point. And they adopted it just as it was, with just a couple of changes, including the tree list. But because we were interested, the Environmental Commission showed interest and suggested changes. The council agreed to appoint a committee to work with us, and that they would make the changes post-adoption. They had to go ahead with the adoption in order to comply with the law. So with to get their MS4 permitting from the state. So we started by reviewing the ordinances from surrounding towns, and that was very helpful. Because what we found was most of the towns around us had already adopted a well thought out tree ordinance. They had it already in their books, and it gave us guidelines. But most importantly, it gave me something to show the council that said, hey, you're not alone here. You're not going out on a limb. This is not scary. Everybody else has done it. So this is a very useful tool, and I would definitely recommend that if you're going to try to make changes in your town, you use something like this. We also took a look at a tree list, and there was a lot of pushback from the Shade Tree Commission, who's very, very oriented towards ornamentals. Our town has a lot of beautiful cherry trees that are quite old. And so no one wanted to not allow cherries. And there were some other pushback on different trees. Some of the council members had a really unusually strong love for crepe myrtle, and we're not about to move on that. So, and our bottom line, another issue that the Shade Tree Commission brought up was a good one, and that was that many of the trees on the NPSNJ list, which would be appropriate for a wooded area, for example, probably weren't as appropriate for us because you couldn't get them in the trade. They were hard to get in the trade in the sizes that we were recommending. So we went with a Monmouth County Parks list, which and removed all the non-natives from that. So the Monmouth County Parks had created a really good list of trees for different uses and in different environments. And that was very effective for us. We used that. We took all the non-natives off the list. We pushed back on all the invasives and said, no, we cannot include any of the invasives that are on the do not plant list. But we did have to compromise on a couple of the exotic ornamentals. But we built in a 3-year review and said, if these go on to the invasive list at any point in time, we can remove them. So I thought that was an effective compromise. We basically presented our final document to the working committee, which included a planning board member, 2 members of the council, and our Shade Tree Commission head. And they suggested final changes. We revised the ordinance. The council members who were part of that working group are taking it to the next council meeting, and it's fully expected to be adopted at that time. So here are my bottom line recommendations. First of all, attend your town council meetings and know what's going on there. Engage the members of the council in the process if you want to go forward with this. Review the ordinance from other surrounding towns, preferably closest to you, and give the council a comparison spreadsheet so they can see this is not scary, this is nothing unusual, something you can do. And finally, I recommend, since this has already been adopted, there is already an ordinance in place, it has not been published, I would say be careful about publicizing before the ordinance is adopted and in its final form, because folks go to all kinds of crazy extremes in what they think you're going to make them do. Finally, and they object as a result without really knowing what is in the ordinance. And finally, we still have an outstanding question, which is enforcement. How will this be enforced? Currently written into it, it's something that our code enforcement officer will take on, but our code enforcement, we're a small town and we share a code enforcement officer with another town, and we don't get much of his time. So we're not sure that that's going to be very effective. Some of the other towns have appointed committees to do these reviews and make recommendations. And I think that's the way I'd like to see it go. But we've decided to get through the ordinance first and then address enforcement. And that's it.
Thank you, Kim. I think what's going to be fascinating here is how different everything is from town to town, because I've been through this too. So so far what I'm hearing is totally different from anything that happened here. Anyway, let's turn to Bill, then we will hear his presentation.
Thank you. It's a tough act to follow. You guys did a good job. I don't know if I'm going to be up to your standards. So I'm from Point Pleasant, New Jersey. I'm actually from Queens, New York. So when I moved to Point Pleasant, it's truly well named. It was a delightful quiet fishing town 28 years ago, and it got pretty built out. It was totally treed. And we take trees down and we build these homes, and it's on the shore. We're right next to Kim, first town in Ocean County across the river. So I'm in this industry of restoration, and Dennis Blazak, who I'm pointing to, was with the Navy out of Earl, and he said, "Bill, we went to a meeting. He goes, you got to join the town. Like, come on, get on the environmental commission." So there I am. I joined it a couple of years ago. So Dennis was the one who told me the history of this ordinance. He said they've been trying for 20 years to enact this thing, and the town council kind of opposed it. And all it takes is one or two people to be a stumbling block, and they're like, well, privacy, and this is my yard, and don't tell me what to do, whatever. So then there was a little turnover, and the mayor was totally behind it, and so it was kind of moved along. And only when the NJDEP issued statewide stormwater regulations, the towns were required to implement the plan. So we modeled ours on Old Bridge, pretty high standard. Dennis made a very funny remark. He said that the DEP model is like a sagging ceiling rather than a solid floor. In other words, it's a very low bar. It basically says you have to put some ordinances, and that's what I like. What Kim and Randy said is find a model and try to do a very good job. So you can exceed the requirements, but you can't come under them. So here's the law. It comes in. Every municipality is regulated under stormwater. Trees are basically, the Amazon is not the largest river. The clouds above it are the largest river in the world, because the trees evapotranspirate, and all these clouds, they literally create rain. And so the largest river in the world is up in the air. And so they recognize the value of trees. So Point Pleasant, we went through this, and there's penalties, and you take a tree down, you put back, obviously you can't put back of the same size. So you put multiple smaller trees to replace the things. And we have kind of this, there's an application fee and a replacement thing. But how do you take down a 14-inch tree? That tree has seen a lot of presidents, right? The trees don't get to speak. They've seen so much, and they go down at the drop of an axe. So it's enforced by the zoning officer during enforcement duties, and there's fines if you violate this. Thank you, Native Plant Society. I came up with this list. I'm new to the commission. We have no non-natives. I think we might have one. The one that Kim mentioned is the oh my God, they love that tree. Now I'm forgetting it. But other than that, we tried to put street trees in, that are street trees, and then yard trees for other things like that. And so we have a very nice list that I made, and it's all natives. And then we have trees that you're not allowed to put in. And of course, these are all over. How sad that municipal officials are empowered to make decisions about ecology and the environment and nature. And, and so they'll put something in that has aesthetic things or people's interest or ornamental interest, and nothing about the ecology. So shame on them. So this one's enforced by the Point Pleasant Police Department. There'll be a fine if you violate it. And so they're basically discouraging taking down the trees. God forbid we work around the yard and save the trees. It totally increases the value of the property, increases the value of the town by having this tree. I grew up on a street, you wouldn't dare take down a street tree. The entire street was lined on both sides with trees. It was London Plains, but with trees. And it was amazing, the amenity and the value of those big trees that are over 100 years old with our little postage stamp houses was impressive. It was incredible. So we have to have that, better idea. So maybe this is a white oak. I did a quick calculator. It's about 100, let's say 145 years old. Maybe it's a little younger than that. All right. It was cut down. This is in Point Pleasant. It was cut down before the ordinance was enacted. Andrew Johnson was the president of the United States. Look at how many things this guy has seen. These events, that's how it was. A little sapling when these things happened. It was a little sapling, and it's grown to seeing this, and with very little repercussions, down it came. So it's so sad, and I'm ashamed. I took down 5 silver maples. They're kind of brittle. And when you take down the major part of the forest to build all these houses, the trees that remain have lost that buffer, that cushion. Now wind is they're exposed, and they're more so one fell on the house, and that was it. My wife was like, we're taking down the silver maples. Sure enough, there was some rotten middle. Sandy was coming on one, and it broke my heart to take down 5 silver maples, on my property. I now have 0, and I'm ashamed to say that. But once you take trees down, the remaining trees could easily be defined as hazardous, because like we had a huge tree right down the block, and one branch fell next door where my neighbor has his barbecue grill. And he wasn't there, but the branch, you could see it. It was on the ground right where he would be cooking. It was this beautiful silver maple, probably the grandfather of my silver maples. Beautiful. And just to be a good neighbor, he took it down. He got a permit. He took it down because he doesn't want a limb falling, and they have a young child. So just at an abundance of caution, he took it down. And I remember I measured the tree. It had no rot. Yeah, it lost a limb. And it's just so sad that tree saw so much history and is gone. So that's it. That's all I have. That's our little story of Point Pleasant, New Jersey.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, all of you. You just kept perfectly to the time. And Bill, I'm also from Queens. So,
Astoria? I'm from Astoria.
I'm from Forest Hills. Originally.
Nice.
Yeah. Anyway, one comment that's been coming up, we don't have so many questions as we have comments, because this seems to be a topic that's getting a lot of people upset, because they know they either don't have a good ordinance, or there are problems with the ordinance, and those are the kinds of questions that we're getting. I'd like you to, if we could start off, if you would address the question of enforcement, which is, yeah, go ahead, Randy.
So, so the enforcement question, Frenchtown, much like Brielle and Point Pleasant, it's not a huge municipality. We're small. Our zoning officer is very much part-time, our zoning enforcement officer, and quite frankly, no one wants to be the tree police. Unlike, I think, Kim and Bill's community, Frenchtown has some larger lots. We have properties with wood lots. We have properties that are 2.5 acres, 10.5 acres, and, if they're taking down a tree, but they don't have a forest plan in place, it's like our zoning officers do not necessarily have the knowledge or training to, go hiking into the back of Bill's farm, for example, and be able to they're not going to keep track of that. Every time somebody fires up a chainsaw, they're not going to try to, somebody's not going to go in there. So the idea of the tree police has been a real problem. I think when you're talking about streetscape trees, or if your municipality primarily has streetscape trees, it's a whole lot easier, because a lot of time that falls under the Shade Tree Commission. You're not supposed to be taking them down yourself anyhow. But I think when you're looking at front yard trees or street side trees, and everything's a small lot and everything's built out, it's actually a bit easier, because I think once this gets adopted, I think you're going to have some neighbors that are going to be like, what do you mean you took down a tree? Why'd you take down that tree? I think we need to shift the understanding of the importance of trees, as opposed to, oh, they're messy and they drop leaves and a branch might fall on my grill, to they're very valuable and we need to keep these in place. But the enforcement question is a real problem. Right now, it's sort of sitting on the shoulders of our Shade Tree Commission, which are all volunteers, which is pretty awkward. How's Brielle and Point Pleasant dealing with that?
So in the current ordinance, ours says that our code enforcement officer will enforce it, but like your zoning officer, we know that that's really not going to happen. So
Yeah.
when we're reviewing our neighboring towns, we did find, I think it was Little Silver, had a kind of a unique approach where they had appointed a commission, a tree preservation commission, and it was their job to review the applications and make recommendations. But I do have to say one thing. I think some of the towns have gotten in trouble when they approach it like, we're going to make a decision about whether you can or cannot remove a tree. The fact is, you can remove any tree you want on your property, but there is a penalty
Right.
imposed by the ordinance. So you have to make the decision so the role of whoever is enforcing it is to say, all right, here's the trees you're planning to take down, then the fine and or the replacement requirement is X. And then you get to decide, are you going to take it down or not? But if you do, you have to either replace it, excuse me, or pay a fine that goes to a tree fund. So those are, I mean, that's important because I think when people feel like you're telling them they can't do something on their own property, it gets very difficult at that point.
But I
So-
think the question also comes up, what did you replace it with an appropriate species? And
Oh, yeah.
at least the draft ordinance, most of the ordinances I've seen also say, you have to take care of that tree and it still has to be alive, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the
Yeah.
road, which
Mhm, at a
requires
certain point,
follow-up.
yeah.
Yes.
Bill, anything on this?
I think ours is also code enforcement, but it's enforced by, like, served by the Point Pleasant Police. That's in the
Oh.
ordinance. So I think they have the police
Oh.
come and say, you have this violation. That's been found by the code enforcement.
So that's in a different part of the ordinance. So that's the way that your ordinance is written. So whether it's land use ordinance or part of the municipal ordinance.
Right.
So it's your ordinance was put in a different part of your municipal code.
Right.
That's
And
interesting.
I'm not 100% sure about it.
In my own town, which is Glen Rock in Bergen County, I chaired the Shade Tree Committee for a number of years, and we started working on a tree removal ordinance 5 or 6 years ago. And the stumbling block, we did all the research, and the stumbling block was always that none of the town employees wanted to enforce it. Nobody wanted to be responsible for enforcing it. And we didn't think that legally the Shade Tree Committee members could go out and, be inspecting people's property. That's because that's what we were talking about. And we're an entirely built up, small community. Very few people even have an acre. So it was just got held up forever. And they finally passed just the emergency bare bones thing last week. So,
But it's interesting because our towns are very used to enforcing ordinances about adding a deck,
Oh, yeah.
changing
Mhm.
pervious cover, putting an addition. They're very used to this, and they process these kinds of permits all the time and enforce them. So it's just a matter of getting over the hump of getting the ordinance in place and then, pushing for the town to enforce it.
That's a very, very good point, Kim.
Remember when there was a smoking ban and everyone said it'll never work, the bars will close, the restaurants will close? 1 week later, we all adjusted. Remember the single-use plastic bags ban? Oh, it'll never work. 3-4 days, we all had canvas bags. We can do this. We just have to do it.
We do just need to do it, but I think part of the problem is most municipalities don't have the expertise, so you've got, when you've got a development or an addition being placed, they come in and the engineers are going to look at it for impervious surface. You're going to have maybe a historical architect that looks into it about putting on a porch or a deck, and whether or not there's setbacks. You only need a planner, or an engineer. You can measure whether or not the setback is appropriate for a front porch or a side porch or an outbuilding. Those are fairly, those fall very neatly under those headings. But when we're talking about, if somebody says, yeah, I'm going to replace it with a sugar maple, and then they come in and plant a Norway maple because the Norway maple is what was available at the store. And actually, which brings me back to a point that you mentioned, Kim, is that, people were concerned about having plants on the list that aren't necessarily going to be available in the trade. Well, that's a dog biting its own tail.
True.
Because people are going to buy the plants that are available in the trade, and nurseries are not going to carry the trees that people aren't asking for. So if we just keep asking for the same 12 species, then we don't wind up having any incentive for the nurseries to carry the Nissus sylvaticas and sassafras, for that matter, some of the more interesting trees. One of the concerns that I've had because Hunterdon is a much more rural area, is that a lot of these ordinances and a lot of these tree lists really focus very much on developed areas, and I like to use box elder as an excuse. Nobody's going to recommend box elder as a great street tree, on Main Street in New Jersey. But, if you've got a stream running through your backyard, with a slope, box elder might be a great tree to put in as a replacement tree there. If you've got a steep rocky slope, the standard street trees are not going to work well there. If you're trying to keep certain areas, even the edge of the rivers, they're going to take a different kind of species than necessarily what you're going to plant out next to your mailbox next to the road. And I think it's really important for these ordinances to recognize that, because we're looking at, they're not calling out tree removal and replacement ordinances for just the trees in your front yard or just the trees next to your road, but they're everywhere in the municipalities. And, whether or not it's a build out municipality or one of the more rural municipalities, every municipality in New Jersey has to adopt these. And I think we're doing a serious disservice to ecological diversity, both in the plants as well as the creatures that use the plants, if we keep looking at a very short list. And one of the things could be done in some of these ordinances, have a list, with an addendum or other native appropriate tree,
There are not that many people who serve on planning boards and environmental commissions who could tell the difference between a native species and a non-native species, or borough engineers or whatever. I mean, we know that the example that you used, I think, between the list that includes sugar maple, but they plant a Norway maple because that's what's in. And certainly we've always seen that problem when you're looking for species to plant as street trees. Which is all we have room for in our town. I'm just seeing a lot of in the Q&A, I'm seeing a lot of frustration. Basically, I'm not seeing so many questions. I'm just seeing a lot of frustration over this issue. Are there good resources that people can go to? Is there any information on the Association of Planning Boards? I know that I wish somebody could post the FOVOS list in the chat, the link to the FOVOS list of invasive species in the chat. I don't see it there. I'm looking for actual questions. Here's something. Have you done anything about education that you find particularly useful?
I have a three sessions of a presentation that it will go over 3 sessions at our local library, all about trees. That's scheduled for the spring. So we'll be talking about this ordinance, but also it'll be an educational opportunity about trees and natives.
That's a great idea, Kim. That's a great idea.
We actually have our environmental commission and our shade tree commission is working together to create educational materials and probably do some educational presentations. They haven't got them put together yet, but in a similar vein, to educate the community about the importance of trees and most specifically the importance of native trees, and help them understand the ordinance a bit better, and help them understand that, if they've got invasive species that are growing, 3 feet a year on their property, they can cut those down. That's fine. But they are working on an educational component of this, because I think that is very important for people to understand.
Any other comments there? Again, I'm not seeing a lot of questions. I'm seeing, Mike is saying, and he's right, having more than 500 different ordinances is nuts.
It is true.
Think of the amount of time and effort that's gone into this in all these communities.
But if you're right, and it's a huge duplication of effort. But if you are trying to look, and I loved Kim's table where she compared the neighboring municipalities. I thought that was brilliant. Frenchtown's planning board did that for another issue a couple of years ago, and it is very, very helpful to see what the neighboring communities are doing on any particular issue. And one of the things, most municipalities in New Jersey now have their ordinance all listed on something called E-code. So if you Google, and I'm just taking a wild guess, but if I know you can do this for Frenchtown, if you Google E-code tree removal ordinance, you can come up with our ordinance, and you can do that for a lot of municipalities in the state of New Jersey for whatever ordinance you're trying to look at. So that's a really great way to be able to access other municipal ordinances anywhere in the state, but certainly nearby your community, I think is a great way to look at that. And that way you can look at sample ordinances from other municipalities so that we don't all have to, yes, there was a draft ordinance we all worked off of, but so you don't have to recreate the wheel every single time.
I also see there's a comment here, or it's in the Q&A, that Sustainable Jersey will be posting a sort of model with resources on tree ordinances
Oh, good.
in 2025. That actually a good way to find ordinances quickly is to use the Sustainable Jersey website, because if you're thinking of working on a particular action for your town, if you are certified through Sustainable Jersey, you can look up who in your area or even in the whole state has already done that action, so that you can find all of these ordinances very quickly and compare them. I think we're gonna wrap it up a few minutes early. Mike is putting stuff in the chat.
I saw that.
Yeah, and as I said, most of what I'm seeing now, somebody has posted an E-code link. Yeah, and then we're getting questions about compliance, but that I think we've tried to cover that. I think we're going to wrap it up and turn things back over to Kazis. Thank you very much, everybody. I think this created a lot of awareness in a lot of the people who were here today. And thank you all very, very much for your presentations. So.
Yeah, that's really all I have to say is thank you all for presenting this very important topic. I mean, one thing I mentioned earlier to our audience is NPSNJ needs people to get involved both at the chapter and state level, and that's how I got involved. I got involved with co-founding the Advocacy Committee, and that was just a great start, especially then during COVID when we couldn't really get together very much. So. There is plenty of opportunity to be involved with NPSNJ. So please just get in touch with us. We have a website, obviously, that you have probably visited, and you can just email us from there. Our contact info is there, or just write me at president@npsnj.org. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers. I don't know if I don't think any of the guest speakers are still here, but I think they were all fabulous. I think this was a pretty interesting morning for me. And it's you learn how little you actually know, from people who are really experts in their field. So again, I'd like to thank everyone, and we'll be having our annual in-person meeting will be in the first Saturday of March. I believe that's March 1st at Ocean County College as before. And we look forward to seeing all of you there in person.